Hello, everyone. Welcome to the My Family Strategist podcast. I am your host, Christina Spark. I am a former chartered accountant. I have 15 years of business experience. I have a lot of titles, but the one I am most proud of is mom. This podcast, if you are new here, is where financial strategy meets the chaos of modern parenting. So in this episode, I am tackling a subject that is very relevant to parents, especially new parents: private school. We all want to do what is best for our kids. So I need to figure out, is private school actually worth it? I'll be honest with you all. I was very overwhelmed when it came to making this decision for my own child. And he's an infant. He's only 2 years old. So while I do have some time, it can be so competitive and crazy that you need to be making these decisions so early in their life. I moved to Sydney 3 years ago from Canada, and I fell pregnant shortly after. And when I was still pregnant, people were asking me what school I was going to send my child to and how many wait lists I was down for. And so that pressure is real, and it comes everywhere. And I know whether you live in New York or London or another, high cost major global market where the cost of elite schooling is skyrocketing, you are certainly feeling that same pressure of, I want to do what's best for my child, but I really don't know what that is. So because I come from Canada, I believe I have a different and maybe more unbiased perspective on things, because where I come from, whether you're very wealthy or you're middle class or you're low income, everybody sends their kids to the local public school. I think given that and my background as a former accountant, I'm really not convinced that the return on investment of private school actually exists. So in this episode, I am uncovering how much private school actually costs. And I'm not just talking about baseline tuition. I'm talking about all the hidden costs of private school. And when I did the research, trust me, there are a ton that I'm going to reveal in this episode. The biggest cost, of course, is the opportunity cost. And if you're not familiar with that term, the opportunity cost is the value of what am I giving up by choosing this alternative path. In this case, the opportunity cost of private school is spending that money on investments, actually investing that money in the stock market and earning a return and growing that over the 13 years of education that your child will go through. So that is what I aim to actually crunch the numbers on, is what is that opportunity cost? What else could I be doing with that money? What is the best use of that money? And what is truly going to set my child up best for success in life? Is it a private school education, or is it the potential wealth that I could be creating, generational and family wealth that I could be creating instead, as an inheritance, as a first home, you name it? And of course, to answer this question, I really wanted to dig into the benefits of private school. I wanted to do all the research and find out, does it actually lead to better life outcomes, happier kids, higher paying jobs? What does the data and research show? And I was truly shocked at what I learned, which I will be sharing all in this episode as well. So without further ado, let's move into our disclaimer and then get right into it. The figures and scenarios presented in this episode are based on historical averages and hypothetical calculations for illustrative purposes only. While I am a former chartered accountant, I'm not your financial advisor, and you should always seek independent professional advice regarding your specific financial situation before making investment decisions. I hope you enjoy the episode. So first, let's talk about how much private school actually costs. Here in Sydney, Australia, an elite top-tier private school is between $45,000 to $50,000 per year. There are other options. Some of the smaller independent private schools or Catholic schools can range closer to that $24,000 to $35,000 per year mark. And keep in mind, that's just base level tuition. That does not include all the ancillary costs of going to a private school. I'm talking things like the uniforms, the technology, music lessons,
club fees, sports activities, the mandatory excursion and trips, even the bus and transport to go to your expensive private school, all of those things add up, and you could, on average, add an extra 10 to 20% on top to account for all of those extra hidden costs. And then let's not forget inflation. Historically speaking, private school admission fees have actually outpaced the CPI. And so I'm going to plot a 4% inflation growth to make this as accurate as possible. One other major hidden cost that I think people don't consider is the overall lifestyle inflation that might come with choosing a private school path. Basically, if you surround yourself with a network of people who are in other private schools who tend to be much wealthier, you may find that over time, if you choose to go on joint holidays and trips together, you're finding you're spending a lot of money doing ski vacations instead of camping. Or perhaps there's a bit of competitiveness when it comes to birthdays and gifts for your children. How much you actually pay for private schools is also going to be determined based on when you start. So here in Australia, only 10 to 20% of parents actually start their children in private schools in their first year of school, which is known as prep or kindergarten. More people choose later in life around year 5 or year 7 when the stakes are a little bit higher in high school. According to the 2025-2026 Cost of Education Index, the average cost of a private school education over 13 years is $350,000. If you were to choose one of the more elite schools and you chose to do that over 13 years, that would actually be $650,000. For comparison purposes, I did look at the US as well as England, and it's actually quite a similar story. In the US, there is a bigger range based on my research, but an elite day school and could be upwards of $50,000 to $60,000 per year. And in London, it ranges between 30 to 50,000 pounds. So now that we have a good understanding of how much private school actually costs, I'm interested in what the opportunity cost. So instead of paying annual tuition fees, what if instead we were to invest that money on an average rate of return of 9% over the 13 years of education? And the question I'm really trying to answer here is, what is truly going to set them up better for life? Is it that private school education, or is it public school or low-cost school and the potential wealth that they could be creating over 13 years? Let's look at two different scenarios. Scenario A is going to be the average private school route. So let's use that $350,000 over 13 years average private school education. So that's about $27,000 per year over 13 years. If instead we were to invest that money at a 9% return, that would actually equate to $638,000 by the time your child graduates from high school. Basically, you're buying a diploma for $628,000 at an average private school. That's pretty shocking, actually, when you run the numbers. That's the equivalent of not only a fully paid off university level degree, but also $500,000 left over for a house or for a future down payment. Now let's look at scenario B. This is the elite all-in path. This is assuming the $45,000 per year plus 15% of that ancillary costs that I discussed earlier, and let's apply inflation to that as well. So I'm trying to find really the upper end of the band here. So if instead we were to invest that money at a 9% average rate of return over the 13 years, instead of putting our child in an elite private school at $45K per year, that would equate to $1.7 million. That is shocking. Put another way, this choice effectively costs your child a $1.7 million inheritance. That's a fully paid off house. It's also at least a 10-year delay on your retirement. And another interesting way to look at this is if we apply the safe withdrawal rate of 4%, meaning they don't have to touch the principal, that is $68,000 per year of completely passive income that they could live off of. That's like giving them the gift of never having to work a job they truly hate because they have this amount of passive income that they can count on. There's so many ways to reframe that money, but it's quite eye-opening when you look at it from that perspective. Now that we've run the numbers, we need to answer the question, is it worth it? And in order to answer that question, we need to understand what are the unique benefits of private school. And really what I'm trying to understand is, do those benefits exceed the opportunity cost? Is there data that supports it is linked to stronger life outcomes? Now, there are an enormous amount of benefits of private schools, from the smaller class sizes to just the number of programs, the enrichment that they can get across so many diverse activities and exposure to different things. And of course, the network, which is the main thing that people quote as the largest intangible benefit of attending a private school. So I needed to look at the data and research to understand, does it actually give them a greater advantage in life? Most major longitudinal studies in the US and Australia show that once you control for those socioeconomic backgrounds, there's actually no significant difference in results or outcomes for children who went to a private school. A 15-year Australian study found that public, private, and Catholic schools produce nearly identical NAPLAN scores and Year 12 results when comparing students from similar family backgrounds. I thought for sure they would have higher academic results, but that just doesn't seem to be the case. This one was really shocking. Public school graduates often perform better at university than private school graduates with the same entrance score. There is, however, some evidence of a small earnings advantage that I did want to investigate, but it seems to be a bit contentious. One university found that a 10 to 15% wage premium for private school graduates in their 30s did exist. And that was accounted for due to the benefit of the social networks and access to higher tier universities. But I ran the numbers on that too. So let's say you have an average income of $100,000 per year. A 10 to 15% advantage having gone to private school would be about $10,000 to $15,000 per year pre-tax. Even if you do earn 10 to 15K per year, that is not at all going to come close to outweighing the cost of the private school education that you had. And in fact, based on my research and doing the numbers, I think you have to earn closer to $150,000 premium once you graduate in order to offset the cost of private school. So I'll save you the math on that, but even if it's true, it's peanuts really compared to the cost. While you're reflecting on some of these results, it's also important to check your own bias. Whether you went to a fantastic private school that you absolutely loved or a public school that you hated, keep in mind going to school in the 90s or 2000s looks really different than the 2030s. Now we're living in a much more global and digital age that's more based on meritocracy and the actual skills you possess as opposed to that networked old school boys club mentality. I'll give you an example of this. I used to work at Google, a top tech company globally, and they were well known in the early years of only hiring people that came from very elite universities, MIT, Stanford, and the Ivy League schools. And what they did is they accumulated a lot of data on their employees, and they actually found that there was zero correlation between the prestige level of the school and their average college GPA compared to their actual performance. And so they did the right thing. They changed their hiring policies to reflect what the data and research showed. And that, by the way, was the only reason that someone like me could come in who went to a public university in Canada that was not very well known. And I went on to have a fantastic career there. So it's just an example of how we are moving towards meritocracy as opposed to the networking and who you know. So for me, looking ahead 10 to 20 years when my child graduates, it's really hard for me to envision that we'll go backwards in that way. I just can't see a world in which my child would be excluded from university or from a first job based on their high school. So there you have it. What do you think after looking at the math and understanding the data and research? Do you have only one child that you are assessing this? If you have multiple kids, that changes the numbers significantly. So I think for myself, having reviewed the numbers and gone through the research, my conclusion personally is that no, private school is not worth it. I actually am planning to change my entire strategy for my own child. I was planning to send them to a private school and I've changed my mind based on the data and research. I just don't see how I can reasonably come to that financial decision.
So the question becomes, what is the best financial decision? If sending my child to an elite private school from year one is financially disastrous based on the data and research, and that is, of course, my own perspective and conclusion when running the numbers, that may not be yours, and I respect that. Everyone is going to digest this information differently and come to different conclusions. But if that's my conclusion, then where does that leave me, and what is the best financial strategy? It's clear that I do have a little bit more homework to do, but I'm leaning towards two options. The first option is more of a hybrid approach. What if instead I was to send my child just in year 7 for high school at a low-cost private school? So take the budget and spend 50% on a low-cost private school and spend 50% on an investment fund that would be growing, and provide that as an inheritance. could be the best of both worlds. The other option is to move to an area with a great public school system, which is, of course, a strategy many parents do, or instead purchase an investment property in an area with a great public school system. There are more considerations when making that decision, although the cash outlay will be significantly higher than private school tuition. A house is an appreciating asset. An investment property is an asset that is income generating, whereas private school is an expense. So my thoughts are that that is a better financial move. The other thing I did want to close this episode with is a reflection on the private school versus public school system. And I learned a lot when preparing for this episode. One thing that really surprised me is that in Australia, we have one of the highest rates of private school enrollment in the OECD. And Canada, where I grew up, public schools are the default for everyone. And because the wealthy and the working class use the same system, the political pressure to keep those public schools world class is immense. When you have a private school system, like in Australia and many other countries, that means people can exit the public school system as long as they have the financial means. And when they do that, they take their advocacy capital with them. They stop fighting for local funding because they've bought their way out, essentially. And that creates a big funding gap and a big problem because the loudest parents are gone, public funding becomes stagnant. Only 1.3% of Australian public schools are funded to the minimum recommended level, while nearly 98% of private schools are fully funded or overfunded. But what the data shows is that the Canadian model is often cited as the gold standard for high-performing, high-equity public education. It's interesting because Canada actually exceeds Australia in every category of math and sciences and reading, and it's not just a few points, it represents actually half a year of learning in the difference in terms of results. My takeaway from that is that it's really quite a big problem, and it fuels a dangerous cycle when we believe in countries like Australia, or we believe in countries that do have a private school system, that public schools are bad and you can't send your kids there. And when we ask people, what school did you go to? It's a tool for social sorting. It's classist and it's outdated. So I'll leave you with that as food for thought, as my own, I suppose, perspective when I really researched into this. But I would love to hear from you in the comments below. And if you like this type of content, I would love for you to follow me on this podcast as we tackle many more topics every week on financial strategy for parents. I hope you have a great day.